Okie dokie. We want to have a video where we can all agree on something. So I figure, what's better than who is the greatest player of all time? Now on the board you'll see Howe or Gretzky, Crosby, Lemieux, Messier, Yager, Rashard. That's Maurice Rashard, Guy Lafleur, and Jean Beliveau. Those were the names I came up with off the top of my head. Where I went, all right, if we have this discussion, which names come up most often? And those are the ones that come up most often. Now, over here in the honorable mentions, I did go and pull from other lists to come up with ones that, all right, I could have thrown on the board. Doug Harvey, fantastic defenseman, could have been on the board. I wouldn't necessarily put him ahead of the guys on the board, but at some point in time, have I done a Doug Harvey? I don't think I've done a career of Doug Harvey. I've only done some Hall of Famers. Bobby Hull. Bobby Hull, to me, is absolutely honorable mention. It comes down to Stanley Cups. Stanley Cups are really important. We're talking about all-time greats. That's why Dion's not on the board, not under the honorable mentions. Eddie Shore, if we look way, way, way back. Ray Bourque, Stan Mikita, Phil Esposito, and 3 goaltenders. Dominic Hasek, Patrick Roy, and Marty Brodeur. Terry Sawchuk as well. And at some point, I'm going to do like greatest goaltender, where we have that debate about Brodeur, Hasek, Roy, and Sawchuk. Sawchuk gets forgotten a lot, and from somebody who makes the argument that I'm a big fan of what Patrick Roy did, is Patrick Roy's picture that's right there on the wall with the Stanley Cup and the Conn Smythe in his hands. He was pretty important that year. I believe that one's from 86. It could have been 86, could have been 93, right? So, yeah, for me, Brodeur's the greatest, but again, we can have that debate some other time when it comes to goaltenders. But greatest player of all time. I wanted to have guys on the board that you can make the argument for potentially being the greatest of all time. And in some cases, it comes down to longevity. We've had this debate about Hall of Fame as well. Do you get in the Hall of Fame based on how long you've played? So if you have 1,200 points, but you played 1,500 games, does that make any difference? Or do you just say, no, the 1,200 points are important, throw them in the Hall of Fame? So we'll start with Gordie Howe. And again, I just put up here, guys, in order of what I thought off the top of my head. Not in an order of how I'd put them. Because people who've watched my videos long enough know I believe Wayne Gretzky's the best player of all time. Now, Gordie Howe, 4 Stanley Cups, 6 Hart trophies, 6 Art Ross trophies. I didn't include the Lester Pearson Award, which is now the Ted Lindsay Award. And I know there's people who are going to ask about that, so I'm just saying I'm going with Hart trophies, I'm going with Art Ross, and Stanley Cups. I'm trying to keep it pretty clean. And then in a couple of cases, there's some Conn Smythe considerations in there as well. 801 career goals, 1,049 assists, 1,850 points. Part of what works in Howe's favor, he played forever. If he had stayed in the NHL rather than going to the WHA, he would have well over 2,000 points. Gretzky would be ahead of him, but that would be it. There wouldn't be anybody else ahead of him. And his goal totals would likely have surpassed 900, might have got close to 1,000. Nobody would be anywhere near his goals. We wouldn't be having the Ovechkin discussion at all when it comes to goals and the all-time goals leaders. 23 All-Star games for Gordie Howe. Now, I believe that includes both NHL and WHA, and that's where things get kind of tricky, is that as a WHA player, his career continued, and those numbers, I think, should count, but they don't on the NHL site, and again, that's where things get kind of iffy. Now, he was first in goals in the NHL 5 times. He was first in assists 3 times in the National Hockey League. He's a top 10 scorer in the NHL 21 times. So, being a top 10 scorer 21 times, that tells you he's a pretty darn good player. And he was a good player for a very, very long time. So, Gordie Howe was one of the, if not the best players for a long time. And he's hard-nosed as well. So, if toughness is part of what you look at and say, toughest, best player of all time, Gordie Howe, absolutely, I can understand people saying he was the best. And I saw that argument a lot in the 80s, where when Gretzky came along and he was just knocking records down right, left, and center, there were a lot of people who said, yes, Gretzky offensively is the best. Gordie Howe is the best all-around player that ever played the game. And I think that's part of the discussion, and that's why some of the names are on the board that are there. So, Gordie Howe, right? Bobby Orr, 2 Stanley Cups, 3 Hart trophies, 2 Conn Smythe trophies as well, 8 times won the Norris Trophy. And He had 2 Art Ross trophies as well, leading the league in scoring as a defenseman. 270 goals, 645 assists, 915 points, 7 All-Star games. And the asterisk with Bobby Orr, career was cut short because his knees went out on him. And so that really restricted his ability to play the game. Ends up with him going to Chicago rather than staying in Boston. And it's almost criminal that he ends up playing somewhere else other than Boston for his entire career. So he led the league in assists 5 times. He was a top 10 scorer 6 times. Again, this is all as a defenseman. And his plus-minus, plus 124 in 70-71. And he had 3 other seasons where he had a plus 80 or above. So that's an average of a plus 1 per game. That season, it was an average of plus 1.5 per game. Per game. So the Boston Bruins, very, very good at scoring and very good at keeping goals off the board at their own end. He was a plus 582 in his career. That's second overall all-time. Bobby Orr was great at both ends of the rink and did things that nobody else can do. So when we get into the discussion of the greatest player of all time, is it wise to have greatest player, or would it be wise to say the greatest defenseman who ever played is Bobby Orr and the greatest forward could be Gretzky or Howe or Lemieux? Should we differentiate, or should we go ahead to continue to have the argument of who the greatest player is of all time and argue about whether or not Orr should be at the top or Gretzky? So we're up to Gretzky, 4 Stanley Cups for him, all in Edmonton. There were some who saw it they used it as a detractor for him that he didn't win a Stanley Cup after he left Edmonton. 9 Hart trophies, 10 Art Ross trophies. He led the league in scoring 10 times. It was insane. 894 goals, 1,963 assists, 2,857 points. He has more assists than anybody else has points in NHL history. 18 All-Star games for the Great One. So, yeah, he was an All-Star regularly. He led the league in goals 6 times. He led the league in assists 16 times. So, yeah, he was top 10 in scoring 17 times. And when we're talking about plus-minus, he had a plus 100 in 84-85. He hit triple digits. Plus 100. So, while he was not really known as a fantastic defensive player, his offense was so darn good, it got him to plus 100. Gretzky, for my money, is the best guy on the board. And when you look at it, and I know people will talk about different eras, and I think that's where we get stuck to. Maybe at some point, because we're into about 100 years of NHL history, maybe you're better off talking about best player in any given era. I don't know whether you go with every 10 years. I don't know whether you go with every 20. What you do with that, but there is something to be said for era adjusted and era inflation and all that wonderful stuff. So, maybe at some point I do some kind of a power rankings based on that as well. I've been asked to do power rankings in the past with players, and I've resisted it, but with the length of this potential off season, we can get into that too. So, Gretzky, and I'm throwing my vote down now. Gretzky for me has my vote as best player of all time. Sidney Crosby. There are those who will look at Crosby and say, oh, you can't have him in this conversation. But you can. 3 Stanley Cups, 2 Hart trophies, 2 Art Ross trophies, 462 goals, 801 assists, 1,263 points. He has been to 4 All-Star games. Worthy of note here, he has missed All-Star games due to injury. He has missed a lot of games due to injury, which will affect Hart and Art Ross trophies on that level. So, due to concussions, injuries, and whatnot, Crosby's numbers not as high as they would be overall. So that is a factor, and we will talk about that again in the name right underneath his, which is Lemieux. Yeah, there's a reason these names are on the board in the order they are. He was first in goals in the NHL twice. So he has led the league in goals twice. Assists 1 time. He led the league in assists. Top 10 scorer in the NHL 11 times. And Pens fans and Crosby fans are going to say, well, yes, only top 10 scorer 11 times, would have been a top 10 scorer plenty more times, if not for injury. And I can't argue with them because it's true. There's a reason I'm wearing the Crosby one for this. I'm wearing the Gretzky one a lot lately. I've got a Lemieux jersey, but you know what? I'll go with the Crosby one for this. He's the only active player on the board, so sure, why not? So Crosby, the argument could be made that if he'd played, but again, that's the whole era thing. If he played in the 80s, don't want to get into that. So Crosby, does he get the vote? And there will be a vote on the channel. So if you're wondering, is he going to do a vote on this? Yeah. Mario Lemieux, 2 Stanley Cups, 3 Hart trophies, 6 Art Ross trophies. So he led the league in scoring 6 times during the Gretzky era mostly. 690 goals, 1,033 assists, 1,723 points. 10 times he went to the All-Star game. And again, much like Crosby, his numbers are negatively impacted by the amount of games that he missed due to injury. And that is a major impact indeed. He led the league in goals 3 times. He led the league in assists 3 times. And he was a top 10 scorer 10 times. So Mario Lemieux, excellent career. He did come out of retirement and play a while longer. If he just played the whole way through, Mario ends up with at least 2,000 points, probably 2,300. If he had projected out, if he had scored the way he was projected out to have over majority of his career, his numbers would rival Gretzky's. He'd be right up with Gretzky's 2,800. I've got to think. When those two guys were both in their prime, it was an insane difference between the two of them and the rest of the league. You had Gretzky and Lemieux, and that's why Sakic's not up here. That's why Yzerman's not up here. That's why a lot of guys who played during that era and in that timeline, I look at and say, well, they weren't on the same level as a Gretzky or a Lemieux. So it's easier not to have them up there as a result of that. And unlike if there wasn't a Gretzky or Lemieux, you could have made the argument that a Joe Sakic could be in this conversation. Mark Messier. Messier's where things get kind of challenging. You can make the argument that Messier was at his best longer. Now, Messier had 6 Stanley Cups. To my knowledge, he didn't win any in Vancouver. But he won a number of Stanley Cups in Edmonton, 5. And then he won one with the New York Rangers. 2 Hart trophies in there, 694 goals, 1,193 assists, 1,887 points. Intimidating totals. And he almost caught Gordie Howe in games played. Now, he does end up ahead of Gordie Howe in points. And while he played during the live puck era, he really came into his own in the 90s and when scoring started to go down a bit there. And yeah, I think it's worthy of note. He had 15 All-Star games in his career. He was top 10 in the goals category 4 times, top 10 in assists 6 times, top 10 scorer 6 times. Well, Gordie Howe was a top 10 scorer 21 times, so right there. Messier was a great player and might have been one of the best leaders I saw. Now, again, Vancouver fans are going to say, oh, he wasn't a great leader here. No, Vancouver was a bad mix overall for Mark Messier. But Messier's time in Edmonton and then in New York playing for the Rangers, he was the best leader in the game after Gretzky left Edmonton. So, there's something to be said for his leadership and the amount of cups he won. He won more Stanley Cups than anybody else I've covered so far. You can make an argument on some level that maybe he deserves to be in that conversation for the greatest of all time. So, next on the list is Jaromir Jagr. Jagr, of course, famously played with Lemieux. 2 Stanley Cups, 1 Hart Trophy. And it was deemed to be that Jagr was going to be the next guy to take up that scoring mantle. Now, on Jagr's front, too, 766 goals, 1,155 assists, 1,921 points. So he's ahead of Messier on the points list. He's behind him on the Cups. He's behind him on the Hearts as well. He is ahead of Gordie Howe on the points list. He played in 10 All-Star games. He did have the 5 Art Ross trophies. So it went Gretzky, Lemieux, and then Jagr was seen to be the next big scorer. And those 5 Art Ross trophies, nothing to sneeze at right there. Goals, he was top 10 in the NHL 8 times. Assists, he was top 10 in the NHL 10 times. And he's a top 10 scorer in the NHL 11 times overall. Now, worthy of note with Jagr as well, he'd be well over 2,000 points. He would have caught Gordie Howe in games played, if not for his time in the KHL. So he goes over to Europe. Now, the flip side of it is this. Playing in the KHL with a shorter schedule may very well have prolonged his career. So it is arguable that if he'd stayed in the NHL, his career might have ended sooner. I understand he's still playing this year. But I'm just saying that in theory, his NHL career is finished at this point. In theory. But an excellent career he put up. And if longevity makes a difference, You could have Yager, Messier, and Howe as your longevity greats. They're the guys who just play forever and you're pretty convinced could play into their 50s. Chris Chelios is another one that looked like he could have played into his 50s. He seemed to get better when he hit 40. So, Yager, I would put in that next tier. I wouldn't have Yager as one of the all-time greats necessarily, like top 5. But next tier, sure. Maurice Rashard, 8 Stanley Cups, 1 Hart Trophy. Of course, he's the Rocket, the original Rocket, 544 goals, 422 assists, 966 points. 13 All-Star games for Maurice Rashard. And of course, his brother, Henri Rashard, passed away recently. And I had, considered putting Henri on the board maybe, but Henri, it would have been the number of Stanley Cups and not necessarily his individual stats. So there's something, maybe at some point I do a video on top 10 winners in the NHL, top 10 clutch players, and we find stats to measure out clutch players and greats. And this is, again, all-time list. Now, he's first in goals 5 times, Maurice Rashard. In the assists category, he was in the top 10 4 times. He's a top 10 scorer 11 times. But what's known about Rashard is his shot. What's known about his game is his goal scoring. And that is really where he was on a whole other level. 544 goals at a time where that is unheard of. It's a number we look at now and we can compare it to the others and say, well, he's below everybody else. But you look at the length of the schedule. You look at scoring during his era. You look at how many goals he scored compared to other players that were playing at the same time as him, his peers. And Maurice Richard's totals are fantastic. So Rashard, well, I've got him at this part of the board. He is one of the all-time greats. And again, if all things were equal, between Gretzky, Lemieux, you got Rashard, and of course you're going to have the crowd right now that wants 87 Crosby to be in that conversation. So Rashard definitely belongs really, really high on this list. Absolutely. Next on the Montreal part of the board is Guy Lafleur. Guy Lafleur, who was really, really fantastic in the late 70s. And he was negatively impacted by the arrival of Wayne Gretzky. Now, it's funny because at the time I started watching hockey, Guy Lafleur was still, about a point a game player, but he wasn't the same as he'd been in the late 70s. Guy Lafleur, 5 Stanley Cups, 2 Hart Trophies, 560 goals, 793 assists, 1,353 points. He played in 6 All-Star games. He won the Art Ross Trophy 3 times. So 3 times he's a league leader in points. He had 132 points, I think was his highest. I think that was his highest in his career. He led the league in goals once. He led the league in assists once. He's a top 10 scorer 6 times. What holds back Guy Lafleur is he's got the Stanley Cups. He's got more Stanley Cups than Howe. He's got more than Gretzky, more than Crosby. That's a dynasty. And not only that, but he doesn't have the longevity. So Guy Lafleur was at the absolute max of his career in the late 70s, but that top 10 scorer, that fantastic goal scorer, it didn't last very long. And so Guy Lafleur, while he's in this conversation, he belongs on this board. That's what differentiates him and his career, in my eyes, from some of the other guys at the top of the board. So Jean Beliveau, cannot have this conversation without Jean Beliveau. 10 Stanley Cups. 2 Hart Trophies, 507 goals, 712 assists, 1,219 points, 13 All-Star games, and once he wins the Art Ross. The one Art Ross is going to hold him down in many people's eyes when it comes to the overall list. Where is he on the overall all-time scorers, but best players? That one Art Ross trophy is going to tell people, well, he wasn't necessarily the best. And then others are going to come out and say, well, leading the league in points doesn't mean you're the best either. So it's a debate we've been having for a very long time. I'm sure it's one they had back then as well. He led the league in goals twice. He led the league in assists twice. He's a top 10 scorer in the NHL 12 times. So he's a top 10 scorer in the NHL twice as much as Lafleur, 1 more time than Rashard, 1 more time than Yager as well, more than Messier, more than Lemieux, and I understand there's injuries that, are going to cause that, more than Crosby. So in terms of how many times he's a top 10 scorer, he's ahead of Bobby Orr. Again, injuries limit Bobby Orr. But that 12 times is impressive. So, and the 10 Stanley Cups, that's nothing to sneeze at. I mean, yes, it was a Montreal dynasty. They were absolutely amazing. Those Montreal Canadiens of the all the way up until the 80s, basically, when they won all those Stanley Cups. 23 in the NHL, 24 altogether if you count the before the NHL was the NHL Stanley Cup. And yeah, so Jean Beliveau, you can make an actual argument that Jean Beliveau, over his career, could have been the greatest player that ever played the game. And I've seen commentaries from people who watched or played hockey back then that said that Beliveau was the best pure skilled player ever to play in the National Hockey League. It's an interesting discussion. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Who do you think was the greatest player of all time? And not only that, but where does it put? See, I didn't put Ovechkin up here because I don't think of Ovechkin as like the greatest of all time. I greatest goal scorer, yes. Mike Bossy, same thing. Great, one of the greatest goal scorers. But greatest player of all time, I don't have Ovechkin up there. Should I? So there's the question. Let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.